morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending where you're joining us from. Welcome back to day 2 of the Aquatic Life Conference. I hope everyone enjoyed the first day yesterday and that you're all pumped up for the second day today, which promises to be full of exciting talks and discussions. So for those who are joining today for the first time, I'm Wasim Imam, and I'm a member of the research team at ALI. And we're very excited to be hosting the second edition of the conference this year. And we hope you'll all walk away feeling inspired to take action on behalf of aquatic animals. Before we begin, just some housekeeping reminders for attendees. The audience are muted upon entry with cameras off. Please post any questions you have in the Q&A box and we will answer them at the end. Just like yesterday, all sessions are being recorded and streamed live on Facebook. We of course expect discussions to be respectful and productive and have zero tolerance of harassment or discrimination of any kind. This session is 50 minutes long with 30 minutes of presentations and 20 minutes for questions and answers. And the panel today is entitled, "What are legislative and non-legislative opportunities to advance fish welfare in the EU?" We are thrilled to have with us here 2 speakers from the Eurogroup for Animals, which for those who are not familiar with it is an umbrella organization that has been tirelessly advocating on behalf of animals for better protection in Europe on behalf of its members. So we have with us here today Doug Waley, who leads the fish welfare program at the Eurogroup, and Stephanie Ghislain, leading the trade and animal welfare program. And they'll be giving us an overview of current and future activities in the fish welfare space within the EU. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Doug and Stephanie, whichever of you would like to go first. I think it's a joint presentation, in fact. Anyway, the floor is yours.
Great, Wasim, thank you very much. So yeah, I'll start us off with, and I'll talk to you about our activities focused on Brussels, and I'll hand over to Steph for the last 10 minutes or so, who's going to tell you about our trade-focused work. Yeah, so let me just get my slides functioning. Okay, so I hope you're seeing that. Myself and a carp. Yeah, I'm the Fish Welfare Programme Leader, and yeah, Eurogroup for Animals, umbrella organisation, currently 82 member organisations, mostly around Europe, some non-EU members from around Europe, and some members from further afield as well. And we are primarily a political lobby group and a political advocacy organisation in the Brussels bubble, as we call it. And we also have a role facilitating and coordinating relations and activities amongst our member organisations. And we've had a dedicated fish welfare programme for nearly 5 years now. And I'm going to give you a little bit of context of what the Brussels bubble is, where we're working, and what the history of fish welfare activity there is. I'm going to tell you some of the activities we've been involved in the last few years to give you a flavour of what our work looks like. And then I'm going to tell you about what's happening just now, what policy processes are relevant, and what do the next years look like. And thankfully, there's quite a lot on the cards there. So a bit of context, we can think of the European Union especially as 3 different institutions. The European Parliament has directly elected officials there to represent the citizens. There's the European Council, which is the current governments of every member state. And so they also come together regularly as an institution and have their input on processes. And there's the Commission, which it's like a civil service, but it's much more than that. It also has some of its own political powers to create initiatives and to do things. A very technocratic institution, and each of those has some of their own roles and responsibilities, but when you're making a new legislation, a new regulation, then each of those 3 is going to have to agree on it before it can be legislation. So those are 3 big institutions that we engage with, 3 big advocacy targets for us. And they've touched on fish welfare before. I've put a few example documents up on the screen here. the Council of Europe, not quite EU, but in between 1998 and adopted in 2005, it came up with these guidelines for on-farm standards for fish. There's the front of the slaughter regulation there from 2009, which has a general requirement to avoid pain, distress and suffering for fish, and the very general farming directive for on-farm standards has that same very general requirement to protect fish welfare. And there's also an animal transport regulation dating from 2005, and in fact that's not a general requirement, but all of the specific detail in that legislation applies to fish and is implemented with fish transports. But very much fish were not in mind when it was written, and there's no fish specific content in it. So there are some useful elements of good practice and documentation, etc., that apply from that, but there are also problems. So let me go on and tell you a bit about our activities in the last years, and I'm doing this again in the framework of those three institutions. So we engage the European Parliament, and we especially do this through and with the European Parliament's Intergroup on the Welfare and Conservation of Animals. And this is a cross-party group of over 100 MEPs. It's one of the oldest and most active and largest intergroups in the Parliament, and we provide information to them on policy files they're working on, and we arrange expert speakers for them as necessary. We worked with them to organise an event in the European Parliament here, which brought together officials from different countries and different institutions, and was really an important moment in letting everybody know that the topic has returned. And it pursued also a plenary debate in the Parliament, where all the political groups participated and a commissioner participated, and it's an exchange of views, and quite general commitments were made to address fish welfare and EU policy going forwards. And we've seen fish welfare now becoming mentioned and attention given in positions that the Parliament takes that relate to aquaculture, to fisheries. We've seen fish welfare content in official Parliament positions on aquaculture policy, on sustainable fishing practices, on sustainable food systems, and now coming up on new animal welfare legislation, and on live animal transport in particular. So fish welfare now regularly apparent in the work of the Parliament. I'll go on to the Aquaculture Advisory Council. So this is a semi-autonomous stakeholder body. It's a stakeholder consultation platform established within the Common Fisheries Policy, and it has about 50 member organisations. Most of those are aquaculture producers. Aquaculture producer representatives from all around Europe, also feed producers, veterinarians, animal welfare NGOs, environmental NGOs, and its role is to provide advice to the European Commission and to member states on any and all things aquaculture. And for the last 5 years, Eurogroup has been there, as has Compassion in World Farming and Vissenbescherming, and increasing numbers of members, and that's as well as the focused policy advice that the platform produces. It's a great discussion platform where every aspect of fish welfare has been on the table and discussed very constructively with producers, and we've worked towards consensus on some issues, and on others it's been a really effective way to understand each other's positions and the barriers and opportunities and different perspectives that we have. And the AAC has formally adopted 2 consensus position papers on fish welfare at slaughter, and it's currently drafting and I think near the end of work on 2 further position papers, one on live fish transport and one calling for an animal welfare reference centre, as we call it, which is a specific technical tool or mechanism that the Commission can set up to do technical work on a group of animals as needed, and especially to support legislation. So 2 more welfare specific position papers coming up out of the AAC. And I will mention quickly also SCARFISH, which is the Standing Committee on Agricultural Research Fish subgroup. And here are academic experts in fisheries and aquaculture from all the member states, and they produce advice on research priorities. And we worked with them on a report on fish welfare research gaps, knowledge gaps, and avoiding disease in aquaculture. And we see those coming through, the results of those and the content of those reports coming through in policy work now. And one of the most important bits of work we've done in the last year, and this is, it was very important for engaging with member states and with the Commission, was within the EU platform on animal welfare. This is an expert group set up by the Commission, and it can set these up where it needs information itself, or to make sure that information is being exchanged. They can have many, many different forms. There many exist. This is quite an unusual one in having member states, the government representatives from around Europe, and independent experts, and a wide range of stakeholders all in one group together. So it's been a really interesting place to be having conversations and doing technical work. Here, there was a fish subgroup. It was, well, it still is, chaired by Greece, the largest producer of farmed finfish in Europe. So great to very effective to have very good for impact that Greece, showed enough interest and put resources towards leading this group. Also participating there is Denmark, Germany, Italy, Spain, and Norway. Alongside Federation of European Aquaculture Producers, Forum of Farm Animal Breeders, ourselves, Compassion in World Farming, some independent experts. I'm not listing them all, but it was a diverse group. It is a diverse group, and produced this set of guidelines with about 6 meetings over 18 months or so to come up with these general guidelines on water quality and handling for the welfare of farmed vertebrate fish. And the content there is designed to be applicable to all species globally, even not only in Europe, and applicable across farming systems. Some of the recommendations in there are specific to farming systems. And it's a framework on which you could add more species-specific parameters on water quality, for example. It's a framework for that, as well as specific recommendations. And this was adopted last year. And just last week, the Commission announced that it is translating this document into all of the EU's official languages. So this you can expect to be more available and more accessible in the near future. If you want to find the document just now, the best way to find it is to Google EU platform animal welfare conclusions. That's the magic word that will help you find it if you want to have a look through look at the content there. So that is work we've been involved with in the last, especially 3 years. And I'm going to go on now to tell you about some current activities, policy processes, live policy processes, and what they're going to move on into and what they're going to look like in the next months and years. And there are 3 relevant. This is how the EU divides its policy areas and activities. So, animals in science, aquaculture policy, and animal welfare policy. So I don't have a slide on animals in science, but I will quickly say that this is a standalone piece of legislation governing animals using science in laboratories. It already has a page of quite general requirements for fish welfare, and the Commission is updating the annexes of that regulation at the moment. So quite a technocratic exercise to update the requirements in line with current knowledge. And they are looking at including species-specific requirements for several important European aquaculture species, as well as zebrafish. And they're also looking at updating the requirements on cephalopods. That legislation stands out to me. It stands out in our world as it's the one example of invertebrate animals that have explicit welfare protections in EU legislation is cephalopods in that animals and science legislation at the moment. So that exercise started in 2021, and I would expect to see outcomes of that somewhere in 2022. I don't have a very specific timeline on that, but that work has started, and that is what the objectives are at the moment. And I will go on into the EU's aquaculture policy, and especially to reference the document published earlier this year. I've called it the Strategic Aquaculture Guidelines. If I remember right, it is the Strategic Guidelines for Competitive and Sustainable European Aquaculture. And it is the sort of headline policy document. Produce a new one every 7 to 10 years. This is a strategy through to 2030. The last one didn't have the word welfare in it even. So it's a big step that there's a standalone welfare section in the new guidelines. And the objectives set there are to establish a code of good practice, to establish validated auditable fish welfare indicators, to develop species-specific best husbandry practices, and that's to include a mapping of enrichment practices. And it creates a relatively new objective to transition to low trophic species, which is a really important objective to have in there on several sustainability fronts, very relevant, of course, to reducing reliance on use of fish meal and fish oil, and a better long-term solution than feeding soy and algae to carnivorous fish in a kept environment. And there will be a follow-up algae-specific strategy coming next year in 2022 to support the algae sector as a novel feed ingredient, and also for direct human consumption. And so the next steps, we already see these objectives reflected in EU research funding calls that are out to research institutes to work on, for example, indicators, but overlap with some of the other objectives. The Commission's talking about providing training to operators on these topics, and it's setting up a new technical assistance mechanism for the aquaculture sector. It's not entirely clear what this will be yet, and it's not clear how what will be established to achieve all of these objectives yet, but that plan is coming, and member states are all developing their own national plans that have to be aligned with the EU plan. And then those national plans are used to implement and spend European fishery subsidies in each member state. So what's in this aquaculture strategy has defined the scope and priorities for spending European fishery subsidies. And I go on to that's my last slide, but I've got maybe the most things to say about it. It's maybe the most important upcoming activities, as the EU is now revising its farm animal welfare legislation. And I call it that for short. It's not strictly only farms, it's animals kept or used in an economic context or for economic purposes. This is now being reviewed, and I'm going to share with you here the main steps in the process, tell you where we are now and what's important, and how we can influence the outcome of this process. Step one is the fitness check, which is to look backwards and say how well did the existing, or we might call it the outgoing legislation, meet its own objectives. And on fish, we can say that it had very minimal objectives in slaughter and on farm, with that general requirement to avoid pain, distress, and suffering. There was really nothing implementable there. No great impact. The fitness check is largely reflecting the absence of fish provisions in the current and outgoing legislation. Slightly different story on transport, where the specific provisions apply, and the Commission's looked at this in the past, and there are unimplementable requirements in there, things that just don't make sense in a fish context. Things about animals having headspace to stand up and non-slip surfaces to stand on, and things, and it has been acknowledged that it cannot be implemented. It creates market distortions as it's implemented in different countries, and that fish transport regulation did not work. It did not achieve its objectives last time round. And the next step is the I should also say there's an open consultation at the moment towards the end of that fitness check process. Very much encourage you to participate in that, and you can follow us on our own social media, follow our news on our website, and go to our website and look at our list of members. And we don't have individuals as members, but we have organizations. And so find your local Eurogroup for Animals member organization, and they are dishing out and promoting advice on how you can effectively take part in that consultation and others that will come down the line. The impact assessment has started, and this is assessing the impact of specific measures that the Commission or the EU is going to propose in legislation, and assessing what the impact of those will be. So that was launched earlier this year. And on transport, there was nothing explicit on fish in there, but we know it's already identified as an issue that needs to be addressed. In the farming, the objectives or the plans that it outlines for farming, it talks about putting fish relevant framework for all farm animals in place first, and for a fish specific legislation to come further down the line at a later stage. And on slaughter, it's proposing adding in species specific stunning requirements for the 5 that's exploring 2 options, possibly the 2 most farmed species in Europe, possibly the 5 most farmed species in Europe. I think only the 5 would make sense. So that is now a proposal on the table to add the fish species specific content to a new slaughter regulation. And timeline going forward, we will expect to see full draft legislative proposals at the end of 2023. And then the Commission produces those, and then the Parliament and the Council have to agree to them, and they have every right to make their own changes, and there'll be a negotiation between the 3 institutions really, and that might run all the way through 2024. It might finish in 2024, might run a little bit longer. That's difficult to say. European elections in 2024 will be an important moment to think of who the decision makers are going to be on this legislation when it gets to that stage in the process, and I flag that as a not immediate but very important advocacy moment to think of. And in an effort to link seamlessly, I will say that Europe imports more than half of the fish it eats, and almost everything I've talked about is impacting on fish produced in Europe. But how can Europe impact on the fish it imports, and how can Europe use its leverage maybe to even help animals that never come to Europe? The person with the answers there is my colleague Steph.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for this wonderful transition. I will switch to my slides so that I will try to stay a bit briefer. Let me know if there is any issue with the presentation if you don't see it. No, seems fine, right? Okay, so thank you, Doug, for this great introduction. Indeed, I work on trade policy which might seem to you very abstract, but it has an impact on animal welfare in general and on fish as well. It's a bit of a pioneering work. Already Doug is pioneering in the EU, I would say, in terms of fish welfare. So you can imagine in trade policy. So we're working on trade policy since at least the World Trade Organization has been created. It's a policy field where the EU is carrying the policy, and let's say instead in cooperation, of course, with the member states, but it has exclusive competence over it. So at Eurogroup for Animals, we work on that topic, and we try to make sure, trade policy does not have a negative impact on animals. And that's why I want to discuss with you today. This is about general animal welfare, but of course it completely affects fish as well. So I will just start briefly on basically why do international trade rules matter to animals? And then afterwards, we will also look into the trade policy, so actually the trade agreements that are negotiated between the EU and how we are trying to influence them to try to, if you want, maximize the impact of EU legislation and also affect other countries. So technically speaking, why are we working on trade at Eurogroup for Animals, or why any animal protection NGOs who are working on fish should care about trade? As Doug said, a lot of animal products, even of live animals, are imported, are traded in general. And most of this trade take place under the rules of the World Trade Organization. So it's a big international organization with rules and also with a dispute settlement mechanism. And so those rules basically mean that it affects how trade can and cannot be restricted, whether you can modify the trade rules, but also what kind of labeling scheme are acceptable, for instance. And it's important. Why? Because often as animal protection organization, we are looking, for instance, when we are looking at raising standards in the EU, for instance, we also are faced with the fact that imports are coming in and sometimes they don't respect the same rules. So we are always trying sort of to ensure that the standards we are creating for producers in the EU also apply on the products that are imported. And this is technically a bit banning the import of, products that are not respecting those standards. And therefore, the rules on whether you can do this or not, those international rules, they matters to us. So let me see. Sorry, my slide has decided not to move. So technically, a question that we could ask is it possible to restrict trade based on animal welfare? Is it possible to decide that we will not import a product because of animal welfare reasons? In general, you have to be not discriminatory between products. So if products are similar, you shouldn't discriminate them, whether they're locally produced or whether they're produced in another country. But the main question here, you can imagine, is it the same product if, for instance, a fish is farmed in very high welfare condition or in very poor condition? Can we say it's the same product actually? And this is honestly a big debate in the World Trade Organization. This has not been decided explicitly. So it's a discussion about what we call the method of production that are not really visible in a product. The very easy example to explain it to you is like, is a cage egg actually the same as a free-range egg? Would you buy one for the other? Would you consider this is exactly the same product? And as I explained to you, this is an organization where the members can challenge each other. Like, for instance, the EU can challenge the US or China the US, and basically say, the other is violating the rule. And then there is a dispute panel, dispute settlement mechanism. And so you have a case law for this organization. And in the case law, you have a few interpretations, a few decisions that are important for animal welfare. For instance, on this debate on whether production methods can be used to differentiate products, although there is no official rule on that, the case law tends to say more and more that consumer preferences matter. And basically what I said, if you don't buy one for the other, the products are probably not the same. If the products are not the same, you're actually allowed to discriminate them, ban the imports or put a higher tariff, make it more difficult to get into the country. You can do this. It's not discriminatory. So this is not a settled debate, but there is a lot of hope that at some point, maybe we might be able to argue that, you know, non-humanely farmed fish is not the same as a humanely farmed one. If we don't manage to prove that, if the products are like the fish and the meat or the dairy products are considered the same, then there are still exceptions based on which you can still restrict the trade. It's possible. Animal welfare is nowhere in the agreement, so you can't really refer to an explicit exception on animal welfare issues. But thanks to the case law I mentioned, one of the most important case is the one that is written first. It's the one on seal products. So the EU a long time ago decided to ban the import of products derived from the hunting of seals, simply because the consumers in the EU were very shocked by the hunting methods. They were shocked, they had animal welfare concerns about it. So the EU decided to ban the import of such products. And they were challenged by Canada and Norway were hunting the seals. And it's the first time that the World Trade Organization ruled that it was legitimate to have such a trade ban based on animal welfare concerns, that basically animal welfare concerns were part of an explicit exception called public morals. So the idea is to protect the public morals of your citizens. So in this case, they are shocked because of animal welfare reasons and you want to protect them and you're entitled to do so. But of course, as you can guess, this is a case that touched upon wildlife, not really farmed animals. So it remains to be seen. We are optimistic, of course, but it remains to be seen whether this could be actually done for farmed animals, for farmed fish, for instance. And it's important because although the case law has been more and more favorable to have more trade restrictions, more rules in order to favor animal welfare, basically a lot of government, when you discuss this at national level, they do not want to do this. And they want basically, they say, oh, we can't do this. The World Trade Organization rules prevent us from doing this. But actually there's a lot that we could do. And it's important because if you don't talk about all those products that are imported, like Doug mentioned, sometimes a high proportion of what is consumed in your country, then sometimes you can be blocked in terms of actually getting a reform in your country, because the authorities might say, if we implement too strict rules here, we will have a lot of imports and we won't be able to control anything. And you know, those imports, they're not under very strict rules either. So it's not really a win-win. We shouldn't do this. We believe it's the other way around. We should have rules and they should apply to imported goods as well, in order also to maximize the impact of the legislation we are producing in the EU. This is about, I mentioned to you, like the rules unilaterally when a country is looking at its own imports and what it does and how it implements standards at the border. But of course, the countries, they also negotiate trade agreements. And in this case, they aim at opening the market. They aim at liberalizing the trade and lowering the tariffs, because, you know, when you import products, you pay something. And this can have a very big impact on animal products, because the aim is often to simply increase the trade and so increase potentially also the production in the countries, because there is a stimulation of the demand for those kind of products. And as you can see, it can just modify the trade flow and stimulate the demand for animal products if there is no extra condition indicated in the trade agreement. And it has tended over the last 10 years, or even 20, I would say, to lead to a lot of intensification in the livestock sector, in the aquaculture sector as well, because basically those are the companies that can face the competition globally, and it's not the really small ones. And so those are the ones that are taking the opportunities offered by those trade agreements. Of course, those trade agreements can also sometimes have provisions on cooperation, and there it could be a nice opportunity to work with partners. Always difficult because, you know, this remains something, it takes two to tango. If the partner does not want to have anything, it's a bit complicated. It requires resources, but it is still also an opportunity to work with countries with who we wouldn't discuss maybe fish welfare in any other way. So that is a possibility. As I mentioned there as well, trade agreement can also have an impact, a bit like the trade rules, because they discuss issues like labeling, could also matter in terms of fish welfare, but also audits and, you know, other kind of issue, more technical, that could affect how to trade fish. And so in a way, that's why we aim to try to use those, let's say, agreement to minimize the impact on animals, the detrimental impact, and try to maximize the positiveness, which is the cooperation part. So in our opinion, just to finish, the way forward in terms of this trade policy, which is very general, you can imagine that mentioning fish welfare in that context is still a bit difficult. It's more general at the moment, but still, in bilateral trade policy, in all those free trade agreements, what we try to do is to have technically what we call conditional liberalization. So it's to have only the tariffs lowered if EU equivalent standards are respected for fish welfare, for instance. If at some point we manage to get, thanks to the work of Doug, some amazing standards on fish welfare, and if they don't apply directly on all imports, which is the best option, of course, then we will try to make sure that in trade agreements, countries only get a lower tariff if they respect those higher standards, providing thus an incentive for producer to improve the standards abroad, and then to have stronger provision on cooperation and to have proper resources to work with the countries, and also involvement of civil society in order to really get something going. The EU has, for instance, an agreement with Vietnam. It would be amazing to be able to discuss fish welfare in aquaculture, because both have important aquaculture sector. With Chile, it's coming, they are negotiating with Indonesia. So there are some key countries with which we could work, and it would be very interesting. At more international level is, as I mentioned, discussing methods of production, raising the fact that fish welfare can matter in differentiating a product, a fish product, whether it's humane or not humane, for instance. And then we could even, bring up the ideas of phasing out subsidies going to unsustainable farming in general, but including aquaculture, trying to make sure that all countries agree that gradually they will phase out those public subsidies that are fueling unsustainable practices. I will stop here so that we have more time for question, and I hope it was interesting, and yeah, feel free to shoot any question now.
Okay, thank you very much for that very interesting session for both panelists. It was very interesting to see the growing stature of fish welfare within the EU, and it's nice to see more member states taking note of the importance of this issue. Personally, I had no idea about that international trade could be restricted on animal welfare grounds, so that's great to see. And of course, congratulations to both of you on those great achievements. We all know how much effort and time and effort goes into lobbying for even the smallest of wins. So it's great to see so much progress being made. And best of luck for all of the legislative processes coming up. It's definitely going to be a busy period, but we look forward to hearing more about how those go. So let's move on to questions. Okay, so a question for both. How do consumer attitudes influence Eurogroup for animals priorities?
One more time, please, Wasim. I have half an answer.
Sorry. How do consumer attitudes influence the priorities of the Eurogroup for animals?
So I would say we set our priorities are set by our member organizations based on their priorities and their interests, and where consumer desires and consumer interests come into it is especially in how we frame our arguments and what policy processes are open, because consumers want that addressed. So I'm not so sure it's right at the front of setting our own priorities, but it plays a big part in how we can pursue them and how we can frame them.
Don't know if that was a question for both panelists. I don't know if you want to answer that, Steph, but if
in trade, you can imagine that consumer, it matters in the sense that, we do, it doesn't matter really for us, I feel, to set our priorities, but maybe to build a narrative around them, make sure they're strong enough, that there is willingness. For instance, it's interesting on the matter I was talking about, there has been a Eurobarometer, so European-wide sort of survey on animal welfare already in 2016. And I think more than around 93% of the European replied that they would want all imported goods to respect all the standards applied in the EU. Honestly, I can guess that just also 80% probably of the European have just no idea that standards that are imposed on producers in the EU are not always imposed on imported goods. And it's also telling in a way, it's not helping us set our priority, but it comforts our vision that there is support. And as I mentioned on trade, basically in order to restrict trade based on animal welfare, you really need an ethical concern. You need to show that the public is shocked by something, that it affects public morals, sort of. So technically speaking, it's very important because it shows this. Already such kind of surveys show that this is actually what consumers want or feels it should be this way. They're concerned about this. They would want that. They have ethical concern. So it doesn't really make us set priorities, but definitely we are looking into, their behavior patterns or surveys in order to make sure that we provide the right narrative, or also to test whether we need to do more awareness raising, because sometimes it also shows this lack of awareness raising and that we need to target our work on something else and to start by building support among citizens.
Great answer. Thank you very much for that. So the next question is for Doug. How does Eurogroup entity work, and how can other organizations become more involved? So for those who want to get involved.
So Eurogroup's an umbrella organization, and our members are animal advocacy groups. And across the 82 current members, there's huge variety there. There are big organizations who work on many, many different topics. There are small single issue organizations. There are also very big single issue organizations. So we aim to be a tent wide enough to fit an animal advocacy organization into it. And then please contact us. We have a process, an application procedure to join Eurogroup for Animals, and we'll find it on the website. Please come and join. On how do we operate? So we have member working groups on different topics. So we have a fish working group, there's a farm working group, where within there's a transport working group, animals and science working group, and that is really a main point of engagement and priority setting with our members, and that feeds through a structure through the board, and Eurogroup for Animals, we're the secretariat who are enacting what our members and board have decided.
Wasim, you're muted.
Sorry, yeah. The next question is for Stephanie. What happens to fish products or animal products that are imported to the EU without proper WTO documents? Do you quarantine such products, or do you send them back to their respective country?
Oh, that's a big question. It's more of a customs related, if I can say, discussion. I'm not sure there's WTO document. The EU has specific sanitary standards, especially for fish product, I mean. There is no animal welfare standards that is applied currently. Correct me if I'm wrong, Doug. The slaughter standards, for instance, are not applied because basically in the EU, the only animal welfare standards that apply on imported goods are the rules around slaughter. And they are basically applied because the slaughterhouses that want to export meat, for instance, to the EU, they have to get certified. And in this certification, there are the same, like some of the rules, big part of the rules that are also applied in the EU on slaughter. This does not happen for fish, because technically speaking, they don't come from a slaughterhouse, etc. The certification is different. And so we've noticed already that, for instance, on that part, fish are a bit forgotten. And it's definitely something we want to tackle also in the revision of the slaughter regulation, and see how we can actually make this work also for fish. So in terms of the only ones that would apply on fish products are sanitary standards. And normally, from what I know, which is not entirely my field, but if something is dodgy on the sanitary field, they usually keep the product or even send it back. From what I thought, it was sent back, because I remember a discussion about poultry meat coming from Brazil, and that was dodgy in terms of some germs and so on. It was sent back. And there was a lot of criticism on the EU side, because basically people were saying, but then, Brazil can just send it to someone else who is less conscious about those sanitary issues. So is that really the right way? So it's not really WTO documents. The EU has specific standards. It's called official controls in the EU. And so it checks stuff at the border, that all the documentation is made in terms of sanitary conditions. But yeah, I think that if it's not good, they send it back, from what I know. But yes, please do check on that.
Perfect. Thank you very much for that answer. I'm not muted this time, I think. So the next question also for you, Stephanie. How well do you think the OIE standards on transport and slaughter are being adhered to in the EU?
Again, my colleague on transport in general, I mean also for terrestrial animals, would probably be a better, person to reply to you on that. I think that there's a lot of issues. That's why we are looking at revising this regulation, because it's been demonstrated a lot that it's not possible, to make it work. But Doug, maybe you want to say something about the specific aspect of fish, right?
Oh, I would, yeah, thanks. And in fact, I've put a link in the chat because the Commission carried out a study on exactly and the benchmarking the OIE standards against practices in Europe, and they found that the OIE transport standards are mostly met, and that's an interesting situation. It's not thanks to the EU's animal transport regulation that is the case, but there were cases where the OIE standards are not met, and then there are. They're very open to interpretation. There are no water quality parameters. There are requirements to have suitable water, and you can have a turbot farmer who is transporting his fish moist but out of water, and will tell you that that's appropriate water, and we may or may not agree. And on slaughter standards, it's very clear that OIE standards on slaughter are only implemented in a minority of sectors. So I mean, species or by country, a map around Europe, it's just here and there instances of it being applied. But I will credit Germany for having domestic legislation on slaughter most effectively, Norway and the EEA, the Netherlands for one species. So there are good cases out there.
Thank you for that answer. Very to the point. So the next one is perhaps a more straightforward question to both of you. What are some low-hanging fruit opportunities for fish welfare and EU legislative opportunities at the moment?
Transport is probably the low-hanging fruit, because fish welfare during transport is such a challenge, and we see that a lot of operators are applying OIE standards without European regulations being in place. That is because a lot of technical work has been done on what's needed to at least keep fish alive during relatively short transports. There's consensus around a lot of the technical knowledge there. It's a chat. As soon as we step into on-farm practices, there's a lot of knowledge gaps. There's a far less comprehensive understanding of what we should put in place, and there is less stakeholder discussion and consensus building behind them. So legislative provisions, the low-hanging fruit is transport, but the big gains are really on farm and in slaughter.
All remains to be done in trade policy, I would say. That's the difficulty. It's already difficult to get, let's say, more detailed provision in the trade agreements, but now the EU has more and more trade agreements with countries, so we're getting into an implementation mode, and which means that in that context, we can a bit more raise specific issues. Like, for instance, let's talk about fish welfare with that country because it makes sense, because they have a big sector, but we're really just, at the onset of this. So it's, everything remains to be done, unfortunately. But I hope a lot of gain at Eurogroup. We work on it because we believe that if we don't, it's actually potentially impeding us in our progress. So it's not a status quo. It's not, if we don't do anything, it's okay. We believe it can hurt us. So we have to do something, but it's a field that's very hard to move on, I have to admit. Yeah, no, definitely. So transport is probably low-hanging fruit, but for trade, lots to be done. Okay, I think we have just a minute remaining, so I'll see if I can take a quick question. In trade, a question for Stephanie. In trade, how do you deal with natural occurring toxicants concentrated in animal products? Is there legislation governing limits for such toxicants? I have to admit, this is not welfare really related. Toxic and Duke, do you know if we have such kind of legislation at EU level?
There definitely is. I don't know it, but I did see recently that there's definitely a legislative framework, and EFSA, the European Food Safety Authority, will be asked to look at specific issues as and when they arise. And they did recently put out a warning on one species, and I picked up on it because it was only the wild species and not the same species in aquaculture that was affected, and that wasn't clearly communicated. So that's the insight I've seen, that framework is there, but I don't know a lot about it.
Usually, if there are risks for public health, the EU reacts. Welfare is more complicated to put forward, but if there is any residue, any, risk for the consumer in terms of public health, then you have mechanism in the EU to react, what we call the rapid alerts, early warning sort of mechanism. So usually that's member states noticing something at the border and then sending back a message to the Commission, and then you can have the machinery just moved up. And it could be that if there is an issue in terms of, risk to public health, that they suspend the import of products for a while, waiting for the audit to confirm that all is better now, etc., etc. So usually that's the process in terms of health issues.
Oh, definitely. Thanks very much for those answers. We're actually running a bit over time, so I'll just say a big thank you again to both panelists for this engaging session, and to all the audience members, thanks for attending. Please keep your eye out for any post-conference communications, which will detail ways you can continue to be involved in protecting aquatic animals. And a reminder that the next session, which is on legal incidents, will start in 10 minutes. So we look forward to seeing you there. Don't forget to follow us on social media and visit ali.fish for more information. And of course, there will be discussions and networking going on the Hoover app. And for any EU advocates, we encourage you to reach out to Doug and Steph and to get in touch with our French office. So thank you very much, and that's panel closed.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Wasim. Ciao, ciao.